All right, so we are going to talk about periodic graphs. This is our last unit. We're in Mod G here. I'm on page G3. We're going to talk about periodic graphs, determining whether we have a periodic graph, and if we do, find its period. First, a periodic graph is one that repeats itself. So it's going to repeat the same pattern, meaning it has the same highs and lows over and over. Okay, so let's take a look at graph number 1. So in graph number 1, you can see that we've got this high point and this low point, and it remains consistent throughout the graph. So then, yes, this is periodic. When a graph is periodic, we are asked to determine several things. For this part, we're just asked to determine what is the period. I'll call that P. The period is the length of time it takes to reach that same point in the pattern. So for instance, here we are at a high point. The pattern of the graph is that it drops down to a low point and then back to a high point. And I'll just grab this here. And if I slide it over, you can see that we have that exact same piece of the graph again. And it would repeat again. So I'm going to just bring it back here. This is how long it takes. So from 0 to 3, and I'm talking about x values, so we say that the period is 3. Let's look at number 2. In number 2, we have the same high points and low points, right? Here's a high point, here's a high point, here's a high point, here's a high point. You get the idea. And so I'm going to then say, okay, well, here I am at a high point. Let's see. Looks like I reached that same high point right there. So this is my graph right here, right? So if I come over here and I put it on that high point again, you can see it matches up perfectly. So from here to here, it matches up perfectly. So this is our period right here. This is our entire graph, right? And it just repeats that pattern over and over again. So really what I'm looking at, I could just kind of put it right here, but let's go back here. Put the graph back. So this looks like it's at about a little in front of -5. And then it reaches that same spot again. A little in front of 1. Right? So we say that we've got about 6. So our period here would be 6. Not perfect, but we get the idea. Graph number 3. Here we have a high point, here we have a high point. Those do not match up. Not periodic. If a graph is not periodic, it does not have a period. Graph number 4. Here's a high point, here's a low point. You can see that those match up. So a portion of our graph goes from high point. Let's try that again, excuse me. From high point to high point. And once again, if I cut this graph out, you can see that it'll match up again. Right? So this is our period. One way we could do is just kind of set it here, right? If I took, but you don't have that ability to kind of cut the graph out. But for me, it's pretty obviously 5 right there. But if I come back over here, so from about 2.5 to about 7.5, right? This is about 2.5. This looks to be about 7.5. So that distance in between them is our period, and that's 5. Okay. Here we've got a high point that you don't see again. This graph's not periodic. Now, look, there's nothing that says this graph may not be periodic and this whole thing might repeat, but unless we see that repeating, we don't know that. I think number 6 is pretty obviously periodic. We've got a high point here. We swoop down to a low point, back to a high point, and if we cut that graph out, we repeat ourselves, right? So come over here. It looks like my period's 4, but it looks like from here, if I'm just looking at it on the graph, we go from 2 to 6. So our period is 4. Okay. Number 7, we go from a low point, high. There's nothing that repeats. It never reaches this height again. It never reaches this height again. So not periodic. Number 8 is periodic. I'm not going to go through number 8. You kind of get the idea. Okay. Number 9, find the amplitude in the equation of the midline. So here you're being told that these three graphs, 9, 10, and 11, are all periodic. Okay, so those are periodic graphs. So then we need to find the amplitude. The amplitude is the distance above or below the midline. Now I say a distance above or below because those are the same thing. It's going to have the same distance above as it does below. The midline is just the middle of the graph. So if we look at number 9 here, this is a pretty obvious midline. That midline is right there on the axis. So here the midline is y equals 0. The amplitude is how far above the midline it travels or below, and notice those are the same thing. So it goes from the midline up to a max height of 1 or down to a minimum height of -1. The distance there is 1. So it travels 1 above or 1 below the midline. Okay. Number 10. Here we have a periodic graph. We're not asked to find the period. If we were, right, it goes from here to here, so the period appears to be 3, but we're asked to find the amplitude in the equation of the midline. So the midline, we've got to find halfway between the low point and the high point. So here the lowest point is -2, the highest point is 6. In total, the graph travels 8 units, right? So it goes -2, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Half of that would be 4, so 1, 2, 3, 4. So that puts our midline right here at 2. That's going to cut the graph in half. So my midline is at y equals 2. My amplitude is that distance here, so it's going to go 4 above or 4 below. So my amplitude is 4. Notice the midline is an equation where the amplitude is just a number. Okay. Number 11. So in number 11, we've got a maximum height of 1 here and a minimum height of -2. That means the graph in total travels 3. So midline's going to be half of that, which is just 1.5. So that means my midline is right here at 0.5. Not as obvious of a 1. Excuse me, -0.5. My amplitude is that 1.5, that it travels above it or travels below it. Okay. So we're going to stop right there. You have an assignment to cover here that deals with periodic graphs and talking about one, are they periodic? And 2, if they are, tell me the period, the midline, and the amplitude. And that assignment is on Schoology.